Hello, everyone. My name is Leyla Johnson. I'm the CEO and creative director of Mohawk Games. So welcome to TactiCon. Today, the topic of the session is Heroes at War and the role of character development in strategy games. And with me, I have two wonderful panelists, and I'll let them introduce themselves. I'll start with Etoré.
Hi, I'm Etoré. I'm the narrative designer of Blade Prince Academy, and I work for Angel Corp. I'm a new one in the industry, and I will probably talk about the role of heroes in a hero and narrative-driven game. It's a tactical RPG, more in depth during this session.
Thank you so much, Etoré. Moritz?
Hi everyone, I'm Moritz or Mo. I work for Mimimi Games based in Germany. I'm the head of design there. And we've been working on tactical stealth games with squad-based character sizes for quite some time for titles like Shadow Tactics, Desperados 3, and our new one, Shadow Gambit, which we're working on right now.
So today we are discussing character development in games, but more specifically in strategy games. However, I feel maybe perhaps because we come from creating different genres, we'll be able to discuss that a little bit more in depth. So the role of character development in strategy games. As we understand strategy, it can vary from a game like chess, where it's a little bit on the dry side. It's really 100% strategy. And all the way to more colorful games developed with, through time, through history, going from, for example, Civilization to more character development in something like Crusader Kings and XCOM and Old World, our game, Mohawk Games. Is it possible today to have character design or character development, character progression, and still call a game strategy game? Etoré?
I feel like we can now, and because we marched into giants that came before, like Final Fantasy, that really showed that strong character development helped the player develop a quirk for them and continue the adventure with them. And also comprehend. Sorry, I'm a bit stressed. And also diving into the gameplay more fully, while living the story and the how can you say that, the up-real story, the strong side of the story more easily.
Mm-hmm. Moritz?
Yeah, so I think we probably can do a lot more than we used to, because people have been working on it for so long, and they have evaluated things. And then we have something like Crusader Kings with a very systemic game that is very based on characters for Old World. And so I think it's probably possible a lot, and it's rather important, I personally think. Like, I think many people latch onto characters and how characters behave and develop in a very positive way. So it's also good for growing the audience for strategy games that sometimes struggle, especially lately, a little bit with getting an audience that's big enough, I think. So I think it's an important part to look into and develop, and I think we can do that now.
Why is character development important in video games? What do they introduce? What do they bring to the table?
So, go ahead.
Sorry, go on.
No,
if I may, as the figure of hero is really hope, as we all know. The first tales of heroes are here from a long time, and we have like the epistemic and the energizing consequences of heroes. They help people and the players understand things like love, metamorphosis, big themes really, into a story and into games. Whereas I will call it token characters, so characters without narratives that you just play for the mechanics, and they are kind of disposable, like StarCraft or like a unit in StarCraft. It will help you comprehend more the depths of the game and even the depths of strategy into the game, with characters that can either defy it or maybe follow it and lead the player into the core gameplay and the core mechanics. Because in strategy games, it's kind of hard for the player base and the neophytes to hold onto it sometimes.
Right.
Yeah, I think that something that's like strategy games sometimes tend to be very technical from what you do and the way you think about them, and they're very focused on a challenge and mechanical intricacy and these types of things. And I think that many people are not drawn to that as much. So for them, I think it's just like, this is not scientifically backed, this is just my opinion, but I think that characters and development of character and stories basically are something that appeals to almost every human on a base level. Like, we like that and we need that. And this is so it can get stronger. And if, like, the most beautiful part that I think can happen in games specifically is that if there, like, a sort of dynamic comes out of it from how the mechanics actually work and interact with the characters. So this is the hardest thing to do by far, I think, where it's not as easy for us as for other media, maybe, where they can just create a development of a character and that's it, and they control everything. We lack a lot of control depending on the type of game we make. But I think that's why they are so important, is to get people to actually care about what's happening, and even people who might not be as interested in the mechanics of the game, but more as a narrative standpoint.
I totally agree with you. I mean, historically speaking, from games before, it's just a progression of strategy. It's just like more developers understanding how important it is for a game to be developed with characters. For example, Will Wright created SimCity, and it was vague. It was just a city running around, managing that. And then after that, he created The Sims, which focuses on the family and on characters. And we saw, how both they were successful, but that only tells us, how the industry is working to focus more on character. And knowing from myself when I play strategy, I mean, I like the resources, the guns, you go after the mechanics where you're making every decision and there's no randomness. But I also like the old world system where you have a character and they have traits and they build relationships and then they die and their heir takes over. And like, the investment makes me care more. So let me ask, what makes characters in a story interesting or appealing to you, Etoré? Like, what is something you care about, and can you give examples of games you've played in which the character?
A simple answer to that for me would be what they go through into the game. I really loved a game I tried when I was younger, which is Darkest Dungeon. The characters aren't very narrative driven, but when you make them survive and make them stronger through the game, and they beat bosses, you have a feeling of a strong connection with them. So yeah, I think it's the hardships, really. What could I talk about in a game that I really loved? There is a Witcher 3, which I love. Because of the intricacy of relations and the feeling of real loss because of your choice. Like with your quest of love of Yennefer and Ciri, for example, your choice will lead to consequences of losing Yennefer or losing Ciri. So you have your own path to create. You have your own character with a strong narrative that you can. How can you say it? That you can lead, that you can. It depends on you. It depends on your choices. I think it will be that. It will be the dependency of heroes and the dependency of their story, because of your choices and the consequences that lead it.
So I also agree that it is. Well, I think there's two ways to look at it. The one is the more narrative-driven way, where we're going for what's the arc of the character, how do they develop, like what do they want, what do they need, what do they achieve, how do they fail, and so connecting on the human side with them, which is very important. Though I myself, I'm usually more of a mechanical guy when it comes to games. So the one that I would choose isn't something that worked really great for me, and it's very different, I think. From what you described is actually XCOM 2, where they had the feature that you can name, like you have these characters, right, and they can die, there's permadeath, all that stuff, and you can name them, which was pretty powerful for me because I just named them after all the people at the office, basically. And they just created these emergent arcs of like our boss being that elite sniper, for example, who would have these moments where he takes out 3 guys and then he would horribly die in the end. And I would keep them dead because it was fun for the narrative portion of it. And that sort of was a moment that, or not just one specific moment, but the moments that happened within that campaign I played there were very fun. And they didn't really come, like there was no personality in these characters, right? They're just stats and gameplay. So I'm not saying that it's better than the other thing. I think the greatest thing would be if these two can be combined, right? If I can actually have a personality of the character that matters through gameplay. But that's sort of a moment that comes to mind for me.
It is.
Yeah, I think. Sorry.
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
To bounce back on Moritz. Yeah, personalization is so cool on games. Creating a hero and personalizing it really create a feeling of connection between the player and the hero. Even if the hero doesn't really have a story, as you said in XCOM 2, the stories of the characters aren't very big, aren't driven. But just because you put a name on it and he did a 360 no-scope on 3 people, it creates a feeling of pride on your characters, which feels really good. Yeah.
It's interesting because even if you like personalization or customization, even if you go online and you order a T-shirt or a mug, just the fact that you can make it your own makes it special. Just your added customization. And I feel very similarly to what you said because I put all of the team in Mohawk games, we put them in the game and visually you can see them. And when I'm playing a game of Old World and I see like my 3D artist, I start caring about the character not dying a whole lot more if it's just that random character. Like, no, I don't want Mark to die. Or it's definitely, and I have Soren come in and it's just like this scenario is built that sometimes becomes so funny and it adds a layer to my gameplay. I mean, it's very important because we ask the player every time we create a game to make whenever they play, we're just giving agency to the player. The player is putting themselves in the game. So it's really about them. So it's just this extra layer of here you go. This is also about you. So it's really wonderful. So what are the most interesting characters or progression you've seen in games out there?
So it's a little hard for me to answer because we have, like, the thing that actually interests me most is where these things, as I mentioned before, come together, where there's a systemic part that drives what happens to the character and not only narrative choices made by us beforehand and railroading you through that experience. And there aren't as many games that actually manage to do that well because it's extremely hard to do and it takes a lot of resources. And the most games that come to mind for me there would be very systemic driven games like, for example, Crusader Kings or Dwarf Fortress, stuff like that. That's basically completely procedural and all the weird stuff that happens inside it. So this is something that really interested me, where I feel that it's sort of unique what's happening there. It's not happening to anybody else. Like the situations and how the systems interact create a unique character arc that is not pre-scripted, and that's the strength of interactive media, I think, in general. Though on the other hand, of course, there are the beautiful parts that many people also latch to. They're more movie-like, right? I mean, if we look at something like God of War, maybe with the father-son relationship and how that's beautifully told. It's a beautiful story. Though for me personally, it's not what interests me about storytelling games. To be fair, we make exactly these types of stories in our games because, as I said, it's extremely hard to do the other stuff, and you need to focus on something. But yeah.
From my part, I'm like a little indie game and solo dev dweller, so a lot of games don't have the resources like Moritz said to create a strong narrative. But one game really transcended me. It was Hollow Knight. But because I had this relationship between gameplay and the hero evolution, and because I struggled 3 days battling the last boss, and I just lived the adventure with this little character. And well, the narrative was beautiful. The gameplay was just sick. The game is just a masterpiece for me. So yeah, I think if I must choose one game where the character development just touched me right in the heart, it's this one.
So when we're creating characters in games, how do we best, like, what are things we should keep in mind? It's a conversation, so like, feel free to brainstorm. What are things to keep in mind so we don't dilute strategy? Like with character development, introducing a character to a strategy game where every decision you make will impact you. Or is it, we totally can't forgive the fact that, we are going to create a character, they are going to introduce randomness, and it's totally okay. Like the player should play around that factored in. Like, what are your thoughts generally around these statements?
Yeah, I think.
Sorry, because this is something we deal with on the design table every time we're talking about designing something like this. And it's beautiful conversations happening. And what are your insights, Moritz?
Yeah, so this is the hard part, right? Because I think it mostly depends on getting a framework right for what type of story you're willing to tell. I think the biggest problem that we face when design and narrative collide is that we try to tell stories that are not well told in games. Like that are just hard to tell in games because we look at other media and think, okay, this is how movie or books tells a story and how the characters develop there, and we try to emulate that. And we always fight with choice and interactivity at that point, because we always have these moments where we feel like, I mean, unless we had unlimited budget, then maybe we could do that. But we usually will run into the problems, and that's something that happens for us as well, where we're like, okay, players can make certain choices and they don't mesh well with the character. So we should probably or maybe try to design a character that has things they can do that mostly fit into what they're supposed to be doing in a way. Or we need to go down the route of RPGs having branching, insane things where it's just content and content and content that you need to build. So I think the part that we try to do, like when we make our stories and make the characters we make, we try to have one moment, at least in the game, that we build up to, that has a very strong narrative impact. And we try to not tell it in a cutscene, basically. We try to tell it through actual things players do. And have them participate in any way. And this can be very simple, of just quick time eventy pressing one button, which is the worst case, but at least it's more than a cutscene, or actually having a puzzle or something presented that has that character moment within it, or designing So this is the crucial part that I think at least we are struggling a lot with usually, and we put a lot of work in it, and it tends to work out sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't really, so.
There isn't like a magic formula anyway.
Sadly not, no.
Well, maybe perhaps it's not so sadly. So games aren't like a copy paste or just a mold.
That's true.
Etoré.
That's true.
Yeah. So on our side, we're juggling with a few narrative points. Like we are a narrative-driven RPG, so we have a lot of narrative to put into the game. But you have a limit of dialogues you can put in it, and we are a visual novel. So visual novels are cool; it's visually appealing, but you have a gameplay cut, which is not something the player really likes. The narrative is really good when it's merged with the gameplay coherently. When you have an elegant narrative, as we say here. So we are trying now to reinforce the narrative, the dialogues, and our heroes to connect more with the gameplay by adding relationship dialogues, by adding what we call now origin missions. Like we have 12 handcrafted characters who each have an origin mission. So it's a big focus point. like you said, Moritz, it's like a focal point of a narrative moment, a big narrative moment that we want to put in a mission, in a gameplay-driven moment too, for the player to have a big blast of narrative content while having a big blast of gameplay to dilute it well and to merge it, and for him to dilute into experience and understanding the story well.
Do you feel that character development in narrative games, RPG, strategy are different? And if so, how? Are they introduced differently? Are they introduced at different times?
Like you have heroes who have pre-narrative, if I may. So they have a story of their own before you met them, which you must make known to the player. And you have characters that will have a story when you meet them, and they will build the story with you. For me, it's one of the biggest difficulties now, because I'm still experiencing narrative techniques. But the heroes that have already a pre-recorded narrative are really tricky to manage in a RPG.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
You mentioned that you are working on a visual story. And let me ask you a little bit more about what is the role that visual adds to a character building, because we are there with you right now. And then Mohit will come to you.
Visual for character buildings.
How do you build those characters, knowing that it's going to be a visual story?
A visual novel story. Mm-hmm. You build them with little quirks and details that the player can hatch on, so he can understand the character better, and he can connect the visuals with the stories that is being brought to him piece by piece by playing the game. So we have a hero called the Mystic, which is a lunar priestess. She's kind of quirky, but she has two little solar pendants on her neck, which the player will discover later in her origin story are the pendants of her totally dead parents, of her late monastery, of the late moon monastery that was destroyed way before. And so you have this quirky character, kind of crazy, kind of hysterical, that will have a really sad origin story that was backed down by these visual details on her. And you can see it at the first visual novel that she will talk. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of the little details the devs, the team, and the narrative designers want to put to the player for them to discover before, for the smart ones.
Yeah, it's very important for the character visually to be believable to what you're trying to attribute to them.
And also to create, sometimes to create a surprise. That's what the origin story of the Mystic is. It's an historical character which is very funny and cocky, and she has like one of the worst origin stories of the game. We want also to play this card for the player to love this character. Quirky characters are one of the problems, I think, of more serious type of game like strategic games. Quirky character can sometimes lead the player astray from the seriousness that a strategic game needs to be played.
Etoré, in the introduction of the character, do you know all of the stories, everything about the character at the beginning, or slowly throughout playing the game you get to know her story, her background story, her ability?
Oh, it's bit by bit. Mm-hmm. It's bit by bit, but you have a big origin story which will show a biggest part of the story of one character. It's really one character focused. But you have piece and pieces of the stories of each character that are diluted together in other missions, so the player can make his own assumptions.
Thank you. Mo, the same question to you, maybe less about the visual novel and more about when should characters be introduced, when do they become more relevant, and when do they become irrelevant, for example?
I think it, of course, depends on the type of story you want to tell and what role that character has in the story. So the way we usually do it, like in our games, the basic setup usually is that we have 5 main characters. About, like in the new one, it's a couple more. Within those, there's usually one who's the main character, but they're all on the same level. Like they have a lot of dialogue, and we just focus on parts of one of their stories. But it's usually the group, the story of a group that we're telling. And we start out with one of them, and we introduce the character, and then we add them one by one, which is not for narrative reasons, but for tutorialization. It just gets a lot if you have all these abilities at your disposal, and people would be overwhelmed. So we find reasons in the story, and this, I mean, I think is something we all know is how the story needs to bend to gameplay all the time, making it hard to tell a good story. Because maybe for a story it would be much better to introduce that character in mission 2, but we can't. So we introduce them in mission 4. So we need to find a reason to do that. So this is sort of one of the parts that we look into, and we try to get the playable characters into the game as early as we can, so that people have more time to spend with them, of course. And then when it comes to the bad guys and girls and maybe the other NPC like characters, that we don't have that many side characters in our game because we're not an RPG, so you can't really run around and talk to people. You're just going through missions basically, and there's a lot of stuff going on in the background with what the guards are talking about and stuff like that. So it's a different kind of storytelling, I think. And we try to introduce the characters as early as we can without maybe, if it's about the bad guy, making it too obvious that he's the bad guy. Because if there's only the player characters and one guy, what role will he have? Like, he might be the bad guy. So we need to do a little bit of masking there from time to time and trick the players.
Would you say that a strategy game usually is the, like on a scale, if we were to build, okay, so here is the amount of things we can do. Let me rephrase it. So, you know how in movies you can tell that story a whole lot more because you have the visual, the audio, everything is there for you to build the best story about characters. So you have all of those ready for you to use them properly. And then there's probably narrative and RPG, and then strategy is like at the bottom. There's so little we can do with, even wording, introducing text, conversation, all of that. So it's doing so much more with so little because I don't want to say strategy is not as forgiving, but it's a whole different genre. So the player comes to strategy because they're expecting a minimum of certain things and a more of other things. So how best... in your opinions, to use that? Like, what do we need for a team building when we are taking that into consideration?
So what I would probably gravitate towards, like, our games are more linear, so they're not so systemic, so we don't face that problem as much. But if I would have to work on something like that, where we were having to work more with that problem, I think I would try to tell a story that doesn't need predicted character development. Like if I, or railroaded character development. I would try to not make a story where my character needs to hit that point and then that point because that's their story I want to tell. I would try to make a game that tells stories in itself, as I said before, that are maybe unique. So, I mean, just a quip or an example, but if we take Gandhi in the Civilization games where people attribute him to being the most aggressive guy throwing nukes on everyone, which apparently isn't even true. It's just something that people think happens because they know who Gandhi is. And like, if I can tell a friend of mine, maybe I had this session of that game and I played and this character did this and they did that, and sort of an emergent story came out of that. That might not be the greatest story, like a God of War arc of betrayal and death and all that. It's just hilarious things happened. Or even maybe, yeah, it's mine, exactly. It's one I experienced it. I think this is what games, especially strategy games, should aspire to do, because they just can't do the other stuff. And why should they try? Like, there is games that are focused about creating linear narratives, and they do that very well. And I think in strategy genre, we shouldn't aspire to do that. We should aspire to do the other thing, and then maybe we can even create stories that are in some parts more interesting because they cannot be created in other media. And this is the thing I like about games, and I think strategy games can really embrace, creating stories that are heavily driven by the interaction that a movie could never tell, because the movie just tells a linear thing of scenes. And it hits differently, and it might hit weaker on the emotional buttons that are pressed and stuff, because it's not like shown as well and perfectly crafted with the music and everything coming together in the scene. But it might stick for me longer than the movie because it's just unique. And
Etoré, do you feel that there's a line that gets crossed if we focus more on building characters that no longer qualifies a game to be strategy? If there is such a line, when do you feel that game crosses?
If there is, if there is a line of of narrative commitment to a character that just cross strategic game and strategic mechanics.
When does a game lose its qualification as strategy because of character development?
Yeah, because of character development.
Yeah, analyze.
I think when customization and the need of connection for the character is bigger than the strategic impact and gameplay of the game. When the player is needed to know, connect, and know the story perfectly of a character, and just, how can I say it? Just take his focus out of the strategic gameplay and focus on the story of a character. That's where I think you will cross the line, because you're dividing the focus of a player who is already waiting something in the strategic game, which is a proper gameplay, some difficulties maybe. He wants to be involved in that. And when you put on his road a strong narrative that will just disturb him, I think you're just creating, how can I say it? Gray noises. You're just creating a disturbance for the player, whereas the narrative is just taking place the place of the game.
Moritz, when does a game lose its qualification as a strategy game? Not that it doesn't have strategy, but it's not a strategy game because of character development. Like, what is a line that you feel to you is crossed? Like, yeah, this is not really a strategy game because blank.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of one, but I really can't come up with one, because if I visualize something like Crusader Kings, where I might, in my playthrough, make purely role-playing decisions. Like, I'm not thinking strategically at all. I'm just trying to be that person, and that's what I do. It's purely narratively driven, and still the game is a strategy game to me, like, very much so. So I'm struggling to see a line from me.
Maybe not to you, more, not how you play, but more, I'll because this is a wonderful conversation, and I'm coming up with questions based on the conversation.
Yeah,
for me, when it's no longer relevant that I have the strategy for the game, like, it doesn't really matter. I'm trying to build a strategy, but it doesn't really matter anymore, because these characters are coming up with all sorts of randomness that is ruining my strategy. So to me, this is no longer a strategy game, because my plan isn't functional. Like, I'm not being able to execute my long-term strategy or short-term strategy, and I don't consider a game strategy anymore if this is my experience. Does that make sense?
Because we're also talking about RNG narrative, if I may. Whereas with a linear narrative or just strong character, I think you won't have this kind of problems. But I think a bad narrative, or a narrative that crosses the strategic realm, is more caused by bad design than something else. And as Maurice said, like Crusader King, you can just play full role playing, and you still have this strategic gameplay going on, because they have a consistency and an elegance in their system of role playing.
To me, it's less about like right, wrong, good or bad. It's sometimes more like I become very specific about defining or putting something inside of a box. Like, this is no longer RPG, or what is RPG really? Or this is kind of strategic, but not really strategic. Like, when you watch a series and you're like, yeah, it's kind of historical. It's loosely historical, not really. You know, it's just you feel, okay, it kind of crossed the line where this is no longer just strategy. And it's not good or bad. It's just that it's a different categorization. It's a different place. And where is that line, if there is one? As we are developers now, and the games industry is still being developed by people like yourselves and myself, we're free to do whatever and draw any lines or reshape or restructure, redefine. So where do you feel that is for you, Moritz?
Yeah, as I said, for me, it's like I totally get the idea of where we're trying to figure out where the line is, but for myself, I can't really. I think I agree with what you said about decisions and how decisions on a strategic layer matter, and then as for describing it as a strategic layer, so there needs to be some type of long-term planability in place. Otherwise, it's not strategy, right? It's random decisions. Like in a shooter, maybe split-second decisions that don't match together. Then I think strategy gets lost. Though, yeah, it's interesting because I think I personally I would find it intriguing to try to make something or probably see someone else make something that is more like that sometimes like doesn't take any of that, and I think it could still turn out strategic in some way. If like I think I would maybe find my own type of strategic thinking if I want to, and then it would not be primarily a strategy game, I think, but I personally don't look at these labels as mattering as much. I mostly use them for marketing purposes. I think that's sort of to get people an idea of what they're buying, and that's why you need these things so they can understand what it is, and you need to understand your audience and thus work for something that works for them. But personally, I usually look at it more from a marketing standpoint in a way where I say, what do people expect when I tell them this is the game they're buying, and less from I think it should be that way, because I personally don't have that line. I would be very fine with it being completely mishmashed random stuff and me not putting a label, being able to put a label on it, and I would be fine with that.
And every genre has its own audience. Like people don't come to games just because they want strategy. Strategy gamers come to games when they want strategy. All right, so I'm going to take it a little bit to inclusivity and talk a little bit about character development. Like, what about diversity in characters? With historical games, especially if they are based in the West, the main characters will tend to look the same way, and also have similar backgrounds. What should we do about that, and how can we make games with characters more inclusive? This is a pre-prepared question, so I went to that. You can tell I read it. Etoré, what can we make? How can we make games feel more inclusive, and what can we do to show that? I mean, from a visual standpoint and from a character development standpoint.
I think we can make character more fluid and stray from the usual archetypes of character we see in video games, in movies, and everything we see in Western culture. I think we must stray from the usual archetypes of the white male, the sexy female, these kind of things. And go through what we have now in our culture into gender fluid people, into non-binary people, into people that want into a whole lot more. I think it's a real good time to pick into a wide variety of people now that we can see in your social media, in your life now. And create based on them, not on the archetypes we see in the ancient Western culture, I think, and in all video games. And something to do when you're creating, I think, this kind of character is just putting the work to be interested, to talk with a lot of people. I think the best character I've written was because I did a night with a total stranger, and we talked, and he talked about his life, his story, why he was like that. And I think it's just having a wider catalog of people in our mind when creating and doing character development and character building.
Thank you, Etoré. Moritz?
Yeah, I think that's also a very interesting point on how to approach that. Like for us, we have especially with our new game, we've chosen a setting that is very much out of our own expertise in certain ways, but we are not approaching it in a completely serious, like it's placed in an alternate history version of the Caribbean. And I mean, we're from Germany. So this is a very big cultural difference between these two. And while I think that is a good thing to do and like try to push it that way, I think the way that we can, like, we will never be able to tell the story in a way that someone who's actually from there will be able to tell that story. So it will always be through our eyes, and it's maybe a good step to have that story told at all, or have the main character be from the stuff like that. But to really get diversity within the stuff that's being created, the creators need to be diverse, I think, in the background. And so it would have to be, and this is of course a huge ask, and it's a complicated issue, and it's very society type of issue, but to actually achieve that, I think we would have to have people be able to tell what they want to tell, be it story-wise or game-wise, make what they want to make, and it doesn't even have to be about religion, sex, whatever, just different people, and thus we get diversity because they will create something that how they see the world. And games is, as many parts in the Western world, is very focused right on or used to be on the white male perspective with all of that, and also movies. And it's slowly moving away from that by giving the power to creators who are from different backgrounds to do that. So I'm sort of like, I don't personally feel that I should tell these stories. Like, I could try, but it's not going to be the best thing. I mean, I can do it. We can try to do that. And we do, but it's not the way it should work. And it's also fine if I tell the story that I see. It might be one that, like, from the white male guy. I mean, it's a story that's been told so often, so it might be boring for people, but I still think that it's, the best place would be I tell the story that I want to tell, someone else tells the story they want to tell, and they're very different stories, and people get to choose which story they want to engage with. But that takes a lot of steps, and of course, also me saying, no, I'm not going to tell that story for the 100th time and trying to do something else.
It's a challenge. I mean, and I find that a lot more developers are tackling these challenges. And for example, in Offworld, it's a historical strategy video game. And everyone, or I don't want to say everyone, but a lot of people know more about the history of Greece and the history of Rome. But not many people know about the history of Phoenicia and Babylon and Assyria. And I felt that I have a responsibility to bring those forward. Even in character development, I felt that even if I want to present a story in which a woman is brown, speaks in a specific way, we are so used to characters because of movies, other games, being seen in a specific way by the majority of the world. Like this is, for example, if I bring a woman of color and she speaks normal to people around her, people of color from her society, from her community, she's not aggressive. She's normal, strong. You give the same speech and the same thing you presented to a white audience, they will see her as aggressive. And to me, it's like, how can I slowly break that stereotype? How can I make this a normal? Like, just because she is a person of color and a woman and speaks in a specific way, it doesn't make her aggressive. It's just how you are used to perceiving characters in this specific way. And the answer is hire people of color to write these characters so they can speak in their normal voice, and we can slowly normalize these characters, make them be seen as ambitious, strong, leading, instead of like, oh, I should be scared of her, she might be evil. You know? So it's like unlearning something is harder than learning something from scratch. We have to unlearn the world and then teach them a new path to learn how to read characters properly, how to read history properly, how to be interested in specific things, and how to read characters just because they come from a different culture. What are your thoughts on that?
As creator, I think the worst enemy is our own bias. We have our own culture. We have our own. We have already created something in our mind, which is set that we want it or not, and we must fight it every day by talking with different people, by working with different people. As you said, diversity in the workplace is, I think, the next step. A higher diversity will lead to more writers, more creators with their different cultures, and it will create a melting pot for every creator to be inspired by others. Who wasn't inspired by someone else? Work, culture, and product, I think, in video games. And he isn't like me. He is from a different culture, and I can inspire, and he can make me inspired to create different stories with different standpoints too. Just by having these creators around, I think it will lead to a big change. I hope in the near future, but I think in reality it will take a bit longer than that because of bias.
Moritz, anything you want to add?
I agree. I think it's going in a good direction, because the thing is, like, people are talking about it and people are trying to fix it, and it's a hard problem to fix because of many structural issues and also just factors that are just there. So I agree that it will take time. The more everybody participates and tries to make it better, the faster it's going to go, but it still will take time. And then I agree that this will help to unlearn. The more I'm seeing it as a person growing up, the more I unlearn it, or I don't even learn it that way. Let's put it that way, right? I don't even have to unlearn anymore because I've learned it differently. And this is, at least at that point, then it's going to work. And hopefully we can accelerate the process by helping people unlearn and relearn, who might not be in their formative years. So they are exposed to a different mindset than we, for example, were.
I'm working on a game currently, and even the way that my characters express themselves, in the beginning, I was like, oh no, this is going to be very difficult to be read correctly by this side of the world where I live. I come from the Middle East. And how am I going to work around that? And this process, I think I'm going to document it after this conversation, because at some point it would be interesting to share all of this with in a session, talking about how and what I took into consideration. And while we are still here, this came up to my mind right now, that all three of us speak English as our additional language. Etoré, you are French of Italian background, and Moritz, I'm assuming you're German.
German.
And I'm Lebanese. And while we're creating games, is the language we are hoping we expose the game in English? For me, yes, this is the main language I develop a game in. What about you, Moritz?
We actually also write and develop everything in English, which...
Simultaneously.
No, we do not do the German translations. Like, we actually pay someone to do it because we don't have time.
Yeah, I'll get to that in a second. Etoré, do you develop in French or English?
I develop in French, and we have a translator for English. Because I, as a non-native speaker, it's very hard to write an English version from scratch. Mm-hmm. You make so many mistakes. You don't identify fast. So yeah, we have a translator for that.
So here's the thing: when we are building characters and they think in a specific way and they use English or the main language we develop in, we develop even the language that they speak, like the wording of the sentences. And here's the importance of localization. As a developer, as a designer, I feel that after this conversation, now I want to build a specific document to explain the spirit of characters when someone is taking that product and translating it, right? Because here we are presenting this character who is not one-dimensional. They have a certain quirk. As you said, Etoré, your character is quirky. It's really difficult to explain that to a localization firm, right? It's very difficult how to come across and to test for it later. Like I don't speak Mandarin, so I'm trusting the firm that is translating this to understand the character. Do you know, like in character development, the language is so hard.
It's kind of hard sometimes, because even translators have bias of language. that you can detect sometimes or not detect, and it can really change the spirit of a character. I had a big checkup like last month for the localization in English, and the localization made a really dark character, really bad boy-like, into a school victim because of a choice of word in localization, and it happens way more than we think. Between languages, the feeling of a character can be lost very quickly.
So people who are watching this, sorry, Mohit, people who are watching this and play games in different languages, keep in mind that it could be lost in translation. Mohit.
I think like that is a huge problem. Like I actually think like because we write in English, this is also a reason why we write in English, because our biggest part of our audience speaks English and is going to enjoy the game in English. So we know that most of the people will get what we actually wrote. And we get the German translations, so we can read those and see what it turned into. We do not understand the other languages usually. Sometimes you might have someone, but we also don't have the time to check all that. I mean, it's a huge amount of words, so it's just impossible. And I think a big problem that we face in games is that the way translation works, and I don't want to speak bad about people, but they have, I think, very tight budgets and they have very tight deadlines. So I think the translation quality overall is not the greatest, even if they want it to be great, because they just can't make it work with the budgets and time they're being given. And I think that shows. Like whenever I play games, I'm like, there are a couple of studios that actually make that work, and I think there's like maybe the huge AAA. I haven't tested it for something like the Sony games. They might make it work because they have the budget and time to do it. Or if you look at games like Nintendo, where they have a very, at least in German, they have a very specific type of language, and it feels like it's been written in German. It doesn't feel translated in any way. So I'm pretty sure that even though they might create a different vision than a Japanese original might have been, it is a coherent vision. And getting these things across, as you said, how a character is, like we try that. We write documents that are like, this is what the character's like, this is that. The translators always have a contact way to us, but still a lot just gets lost in it. And this is not like me trying to talk down the translators. It's just the reality of what's happening. And I think if I look at how, for example, a novel is being translated, it just takes so much longer. Like if it's well translation, right? That's such a different thing than a person getting an Excel sheet where they're just going through random lines, translating them with a little bit of context maybe, which of course it's not going to be the same thing. So that is a huge issue that people should have in mind and that we maybe should try to fix in some way, because it's, even if you try to educate them, they just can't do it because the surrounding is so hard.
They can't.
Go ahead.
Sorry. They can't, and sometimes it's just automatized. You have really an automatized system which is after checked by the translators themselves. But any automatized system will make mistake, especially in something as hard as traduction. So the margin of error in traduction and localization is quite hard, and it's not the fault of the localization, the traductor. It's kind of how the industry is working right now. Even I think for AAA studios, which may have, I think, intern localization services. I think it's really hard to not miss the point of the original language when you localize somewhere else than your own studio or just to you.
This is super interesting, because now I have like this, on top of everything, I have this new question that I'll never be able to answer, but I'm going to make you suffer just like I'm suffering right now. So here's the problem. So for example, quirky is in the United States, it's fun. It's someone who's fun and has like these odd quirks. In Lebanon, it's someone who's silly. You can present the same character, but in Lebanon, they'll be like, she's silly, which is a little bit on the negative side. Here, oh, she's fun. She's, which is a little bit on the positive side. It's just, she has her quirks. So when we are taking our character to different cultures, we should also see how cultures view these characters. Like Rome was famous for having ambition, and people who were ambitious, that's a good trait. But in Greece, people who were ambitious were dangerous from the reading of history. So are different traits from country to country, from nation to nation, from community to community, society to society different. We might have created this character to make sense in the United States. When we translate this character, even if someone understood the essence of what we created, can they help us make this character more appealing in a different culture? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I get that. I think that something we talked before about what languages we write, and I think that sort of goes into that and also the diversity part of it. I think in a way that is fine, because I mean, you've then created a character that is viewed in a certain way in the US maybe, and someone else might view it differently, but that's sort of the beauty of it, because it shows the different types of cultures. And creating a character that has that because they have something that's actually culturally relevant for where they're from is good, right? I mean, I think when I look at, as I said before, we're making games that are taking place not in Germany. Like we've never done a place, so we cannot really put that in as much our own culture into the game. If I look at like the games made in Poland, for example, like if you take The Witcher as an example, or also this War of Mine, these games, they have a certain type of narrative flavoring or vibe in them that I think is probably very specific to Poland. And even though the words they use and everything might not be like Polish, there is an identity, a cultural identity I can see in these games that only people who are coming from there might be able to tell the way they do it. And this is great. And then maybe someone from a completely different country, and maybe Japan, might see something they did and be like, that character is completely different from what it was intended to be, but that's good because it actually mattered that the character was their way. And we sort of have to let go of that, I think, as creators trying to control that. It's like, I'm rambling again, sorry. With the systemic game where you have to let go. Like people might get into weird stuff and weird stuff might happen, but we're not trying to control that as a designer. We're saying, this is your game, go ahead. And we can do the same with characters in a way. And then maybe they will learn that the character was intended differently and they will have a laugh about it and understand the cultural difference, or they won't and love or hate the character for a reason we never expected, but it doesn't matter.
It's an interesting point before I go to Etoré. You mentioned 11-Bit Studios, the makers of This War of Mine and Frostpunk. We interviewed in our podcast, Designer Notes, Mika and Shamish from the developing team. And they talked about when they were developing This War of Mine, they said a very interesting line that is relevant here. And they said, when Americans make a game about war, they have to win it. When in Poland, the Polish make a game about war, they have to survive it. And it's still, it's so relevant right now. And then in a conference, they were in a session and they talked a little bit about Frostpunk, and they said that in the end, the game kind of throws back at you all of your decision making. And they said in China, that was received with like, why are you punishing me for options you presented me with? And they specified there was a region in the world that took offense to this type of like, look, you put me in this situation, now you're punishing me for making these decisions. So it is interesting how as we make video games for a whole globe, how global it is becoming and how it's coming back at us. Etoré.
Yeah, I think I'm quite satisfied with having one vision finished for the time being because of production and the industry. But I think it's one of the magic of narrative and stories and strong characters to change depending on the culture. But I think if we want to talk about a realistic standpoint, we can't. How do you say it? I'm sorry. You can't know for sure. You can know for sure what will be culturally good or not in every part of the globe. You will have to live with the flow, if I may say. And as Moritz said, sometimes it can lead to good surprises and characters that resonates in a different way, but still resonates within another culture. It's not just negative for me. We have something in France that was really fun, which is City Hunter or Nicky Larson. I don't know if you know it. which is a really serious anime. And when it came to France and it was translated, it became Nicky Larson, which is a huge humoristic meltpot of the anime. So you have really two strong visions of the series, which led to two different fan bases. And I see cultures through this now. Like if a character changes with a culture, it's not that bad, unless it's lost its soul. When you lose the soul of a character because of culture and differences of culture, like Frostpunk, what you said with China, they took it wrong. But it's the essence of the game to have the player take responsibility for his decisions. You can't. How can you know that before? Do you need to know every aspect of every decision of the game culturally? It's a quite hard subject, and it will need a humongous culture from one individual to know that.
And maybe it was a statement too, like you cannot run a surviving game without having to make very difficult decisions. Like maybe maybe the game is trying to teach us something or tell us something. And which brings me to a question. Is it possible to develop characters and teach a moral lessons through them? I know the answer, but I want to hear from you.
I think when you talk about morals, it's heavily depending on the culture. So no, I think you can't teach the same moral all around the globe. It's quite impossible. With Frostpunk, it showed that the moral of responsibility toward your actions doesn't necessarily work somewhere else.
Okay. Right.
Yeah, I mean, if we're looking through that, of course, it's probably hard. Though I would argue that maybe they just didn't understand like the principle or didn't like the principle. It doesn't really. Maybe would have to look into the Frostpunk example, of course, and talk to them directly, I guess. But I think in general, of course, you can. I mean, right? It's what we're doing all the time when we write characters. Having it applicable over all the globe, that might be a problem, as we just discovered. But I mean, that's what we try to do. Well, not always with characters. It doesn't have to be about morals. It can just be seeing yourself in that character for whatever reason and enjoying that journey as well. But yes, of course, we can and we also should. Well, depends on the type of story you want to tell. As usual, I don't think you have to do that.
True, and it's interesting how a character isn't just the visual and the story and their set of beliefs. They're also the way they speak and how it comes across to the player. Like it's a responsibility, and all of these things make it way more difficult for developers to hand in a game to you, everyone who's listening to this. So, and I take a certain personal story that happened just last week with my kid, who's 11 years old, a girl. And she told her friend who was dressed up with like these long socks with a ribbon on top. It's like, oh, Catherine, by the way, my daughter's Catherine. We're going to Japan. They love the Japanese culture. So she looked at this other friend and she said, oh my gosh, you're dressed like an anime. And that particular person took offense to what Catherine said. And Catherine came back heartbroken, like, Mom, what did I say? What did I say that was so offensive? And I said, I really do not know. I don't think you should change anything, but maybe you should reach out to her and tell her what you meant. Maybe she doesn't know what anime is, which is very difficult. Again, it's very difficult for me from this culture now to imagine there's a child who doesn't know what anime is, right? But at the same time, perhaps she doesn't know what anime is. She doesn't understand what Catherine is trying to say by her. Maybe her understanding of anime or her exposure to anime is negative. So, like there are so many other layers to consider. Some things can be lost in translation. Are there moral lessons that are universal, that everyone would agree this is bad, this is good? Or it's all really gray?
Tough question.
Yeah.
Tough question. I will advance that it's gray, even if I think it's more of a personal standpoint than really an argument. But I think we have morals that can come close, like death of a loving one, love, which is quite universal. It proved to be quite universal, even if it comes in different forms because of the culture. But I think the essence of love could be one of the morals that could lead to a universal comprehension.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, I think there are some things that most cultures agree on morally, like killing is bad. But
But
I don't
maybe
even
killing
think that.
the bad guy isn't bad.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it gets a little fuzzy there again. So I don't think. Like, I think there are things that exist in most cultures in different ways. Though I personally, when I would try to create a story or a character, and I would want to put a moral in there, I wouldn't concern myself too much with how every culture on the world sees it. I would try to maybe not offend people. Like, maybe if I can, depending on how important I think that certain moral is. Like, if there was a person who said killing everyone is good, I might be fine with offending them. But like, I wouldn't get bogged down by that too much when I think that I have something where I understand the moral from my perspective, and I think it's worth mentioning or telling that story. And then the worst thing that could happen is a conversation ensues, depending on how the participants behave, of course. And then we could learn why that other person maybe did not agree with that moral of mine, and then we might find a common ground, or we might not, and that could also be fine if it all went civilized. So.
Yeah, I think I would be kind of deceived if everyone would have the same comprehension of something or a narrative. You wouldn't have debates. We wouldn't be here if we had the same comprehension of narrative and stories. So I'm kind of with Moritz that when I design, yes, I'm designing for I think someone with my culture because I'm creating, but I also want someone who is outside of questioning his culture, questioning my culture, questioning the narrative and what it means to the person. It's quite the quest for the player attention.
These are all very interesting conversations and topics, like building a healthy game, or not. Like what are, maybe there are general guidelines, like in games we make. Colonization is, you can't colonize other nations. That's bad. You can't make these games anymore. You shouldn't. Things like that. Or if you do make them, from whose point of view is that? And these are all very problematic issues. And yes, things can be a little bit white and black, but they're certainly not definitely white and definitely black. Most of the time it's like that whole area of gray. All right, I know that we are closing in on ending this session, so I'm going to go back to one final question, and then I'm going to open it to you if you have a question you want to suggest and bring to the table. And my question is, how many characters should be in a game, and where is the line between breadth, which is the number of characters, versus depth, fewer characters but more developed? In your opinion, or it's irrelevant, or let's talk about that.
It depends on the budget. I think the budget, the scope of the game, the frame of the game. If you have the budget and a limited time and unlimited writers, you could do a thousand well-written characters. But I think the player will take interest in 3 max. I think you must know the limits of your player base and what they can digest narratively. So it really depends on the game itself. I think if I may take a number, I would think in a mid-scale narrative, like 8 to 15 hours. 5 to 8 well-written characters are the limit for me.
Okay, and that goes to different genres, or in a specific genre?
It will go in the strategic genre here, strategic RPG. In other types of game, I'm a huge roguelite player, and in roguelites, it's really easy to have a whole lot of characters that you can develop run by run when you want with RNG events, with RNG narrative. You don't have that kind of tools in RPG, so you must digest the stories of every hero in your scope and in your big uproar story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I couldn't as I agree that it depends on the type of game you're making, basically, and that means genre, but also mostly I think the creative vision of what this game is supposed to be, and that will then tell me how many characters, like what do I even do with these characters, right? I mean, what's the interaction I have with them, and that can inform how deep they need to be and how many I can put in there. Of course, in combination with the budget, but I mean, the creative vision is always driven by the budget in a way, because you know what you can do, and if you do something you can't do, you're probably doing a bad job at what you're doing. So, not saying like that it happens to us all the time, right? Because making games is very hard. But if I would have a budget of 10,000 euros and make a game where I want to write 5 million characters in depth, that might be a mismatch from my creative vision. That's what I mean. Yeah. So yeah, I think you can.
That won't make the game.
No, it won't. And so I think it actually depends on the game. I can imagine a game where you only focus on that one character and you want to flesh them out as deep as you can. And I can imagine a game where you make 1,000 characters who are extremely thin, but the way I interact with them, maybe even procedurally generated, maybe looking at something like Watch Dogs Legion, where they have all these procedurally generated NPCs. They aren't deep in any way. They don't have to be. And people maybe would have loved them to be more deep, but you can do all of that if you know what you're doing and if you have a goal that makes sense with what you're doing there. And then it might still not work out, but I think that's the initial important part. So I would say you can do whatever you want as long as your game, you know what kind of game you're making, and thus do the right thing for that game.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like the only place where quantity becomes overwhelming to me is a narrative. I can only retain a certain amount of characters and get to know them, but if they become so many, it becomes a little bit overwhelming for me. Other places,
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones, right? They have so many characters, and I feel like they've developed them well. And you can tell. That's my opinion, of course. You relate, or that's a great example on conversation, right? If I am here and telling you, oh, Cersei is the most developed character, I really like her complexity, and each one of you goes, yep, I agree, it's boring, then somebody failed somewhere, right? You might think it's Tyrion, you might think, no, it's really, someone else. And that's why creating one specific thing in one specific way, thank God for multiculturalism, because we come from different places, we see different things.
And we have our own creative limits because of our culture. I think we can all write 100 different characters, but they will become similar in a way. We have a limit of creation. So yeah, thanks for it. Thanks for the numerous creators who will come, who are coming, we are here. It's gonna be a good time for narration.
As we come, this is it. We're wrapping up. I would like each one of you to tell me a little bit about what would you tell people who are character developers. What is the best advice, if you can? I know this is like the hardest thing. Anytime somebody says, Leyla, what is an advice you'd like to give? You can't. It's just really how you see things. But if we were getting close on what is a general guideline or something that means something to you when you're developing characters, what would you like, Etoré, to tell people who listen today to this session when they're developing key characters in strategy games? What should they keep in mind?
Make them relatable. A non-relatable character is just boring, and as it was said a long time ago, the best bad characters are those you can understand, and you can understand their motives, why they do it, even if you know in the setting of the universe it's a bad thing, but you can understand why they want to through those lengths. And it can be for heroes too. You know why they go through these hardships, these stories, and this suffering. Because they're relatable, and you know why, you know the purpose of their quests and their story.
Moritz, what would you tell people who are developing characters and strategy games?
So I would suggest that one of the most important things is to understand, in my opinion, is to understand what type of game you're making and what roles these characters fill, and not create a mismatch. And what I mean by that is I might have the best idea for a character, very deep development. Like there's something that we face a lot, right? We have only so much space to tell stories about characters in that game. And we need to find a character arc, a narration, and way of that character to work that fits into that space. And if you fail at that, we might have had the best idea ever for the character, but we can't deliver on it. And nobody's going to feel the development of that character the way we want to. And it's going to fall flat and it's going to feel bad. And I think that's something that you can run into very easily, is having these, because we have so many influences of great characters around us in media, especially not non-game media, where we're like, I want to create this. But we need to figure out, does this actually fit into the game? And I think that is especially important for strategy games who have a very limited slot. It's much smaller than other games might have, because the systemicness and stuff like that, it just is such a huge aspect of it. Yeah. So to sum it up, I would say, see what type of game you're making and create narratives that fit into that game. And then it's going to be a great character, even if it's not as deep or fleshed out as a character in a different game or movie that you've watched, because they have more space than you do.
Is there anything either of you would like to add to the topic before?
So I wanted to ask, because I'm a little junior, and I wanted to know about your hardest difficulty in one of your projects, if I may. Narratively speaking, one of your creative hardships in a project, or something that made you battle, because I want to learn. I want to learn from people's hardships, especially veterans in the industry.
So for me, when I was building the narrative for Offworld, which is a historical strategy video game, it was reading and interpreting history and wanting to mechanize and create those characters out of history. And it was this constant. So first of all, for me, it was the lack of resources. So there was abundance of resources for example, Rome or Greece, but then there aren't many when we are seeing something else, and the representation isn't there. So you have to dig deeper and try to understand how that culture back then worked, and how to develop a character coming from the bosom of that culture that makes sense to that culture. And then develop a family, because we have family trees, and a whole narrative for them. And while we moved on from that to this new thing that I'm working on, I can't really specify right now. The thing that I'm facing is what I mentioned a little bit earlier, where there's a specific type of speech that I'm using that makes sense to that part of the world, but I need to make sure that it is seen this way in the rest of the world. So language and interpretation of tone and making it relevant to the traits that this person possesses. So she's brave and she talks with confidence many years ago. And I want to make sure that she spoke in the language that she's born with, in that very, very colorful, poetic way. But I also want to make it relevant today in the West, because this is where people buy these games. This is where people, these are the players who will be interested in this. So it is definitely a Mount Everest for me. And it is going to be really hard in traduction, in translation. Like, all right, so how do we translate it to Mandarin? How do we translate it to German? Well, how does that look like in German? Right? It's very specific. I know how to do it from the original language to English, but then how will I be able to tell this to my German translator? And what are the traits I need to highlight that this becomes, as a character, translated correctly to mean that this woman is powerful, strong, brave, and has a very strong sense of responsibility. So this is my challenge. And it's gonna come back to you, Etoré. So you're not gonna.
That's a nice one. Okay, nice. I won't dodge it.
Yeah, so I think for us, or me personally, when we are telling the stories, as it's sort of what I mentioned before, is the struggle of figuring out the type of story and characters that we can have in the framework that our game is. And which I basically mean by is we are constantly struggling with, we want to do this, but how do we make it work with the player fudging around in it, and also with the idea the players have in their head about how this should work. Very simple example is like our game is all about killing, right? I mean, you're stabbing thousands of people to get to your goal. Something that would come to mind maybe is like Dishonored does it, for example, is put a label on that and say this is bad, for example, right? Make a game where you kill a lot of time and then in the end you put a twist on it and say this was bad that you did that. But for our games, this type of stuff doesn't work because, well, it might sound a little morbid, but I mean, our game is fun. You know, we design a game to be fun. It's not a serious game from the narrative it wants to bring about that. So I wouldn't want to do that. I want to be able to have you just have fun killing these people. So we need to characterize them in a way, right? They cannot be real people. They need to be these small little stormtrooper-like puppets and stuff like that. These types of things. And down the line, we always run into this, and it gets the hardest with actually emotional moments involving the characters and the things happening on screen, like the big revelation, the big emotional moment. Building these is the most hard thing to do. And something that I would add on top of that I've learned after shipping a couple of games was that while you're working on it, you always need to take a step back and think about what the people who are actually playing it will think about it, because they do not know anything of the cool or whatever stuff that you've thought of before that you couldn't do. So none of that is going to matter to them. And you're going to be like, oh man, I really need to make this thing work. This is a bad scene because I didn't get to do this one thing, but the scene is still great. Then you never knew this thing existed in the first place. Only you and people in the team maybe know, and they might be heartbroken about it missing. But it helps to sometimes take that perspective and be like, yeah, this scene could have been that, but it's that, and that's still cool. People still love it. So
yeah, lower a bit the expectations.
Yeah, just realize that exactly that maybe it's what you're doing is actually cool, even though it's not what you initially wanted to do. There is still a merit in that.
That's how gamers make your games different than you've seen them and better. Maybe.
Hopefully.
Hopefully, yeah.
Etoré, you have to answer your own question.
So it's my turn. So my biggest hardship was not a long time ago. It was like 1 or 2 months ago. We went through a big narrative rework where we went from Darkest Dungeon type of heroes, where we had like three unique heroes and a lot of token throwable characters to help them through the quests. So the unique heroes couldn't die, the throwable characters could die when you wanted. And now we have 12 unique heroes. So the dispatching and the writing of 12 strong characters instead of 3, and the dispatching in the length of the game, because we have like 40 missions. For 3 heroes, we could go in depth with their origin story, with their journey. And now with 12 unique heroes, we need to, how can we say it? I needed to find a system to tell the story of 12 people instead of 3 by mixing them a bit and doing a huge rework on the narrative aspect of the game without impacting gameplay, without impacting visuals, without asking my dev to do an all night, because it's not what you want in narrative. You are, even if you don't want it, you have one of the things that can be changed the faster in studio. So you have to take it. You have to make the modifications with thinking about all the other people around you in your team that you must not touch their work to be the most coherent possible. So yeah, I think passing from 3 to 12 was a huge challenge. which hopefully is now taken. And I hope I will do my best for it.
Etoré, did you feel that the challenge was also developing uniqueness to each character now that you have 12?
Yeah. Developing uniqueness, developing huge character traits to make them knowable to the player. And they don't. I wanted to have not only the visuals that made the player say, "Oh, okay, it's this one. It's character number 3." I wanted to have this reaction with only the dialogues. So I made a test with my team to see if they could find each character with just the dialogues, which was one of the hardest things to do. They had 10 out of 12 in my last tests, so I will see for the 2 next. I think they won't talk. I think I will make 2 characters not talk. It will be the easiest one.
But it's even hard in real life to have 12 people and ask people to distinguish between them. I mean, there are going to be this huge pool of similarities, and then these just unique, smaller pools of each character.
Yeah, but in real life you don't need to remember them. In a game, you want your player to remember each and every one of your character, to not be lost in the narrative.
True. It's exaggerating these differences.
Yeah, you're exaggerating. You're making sometimes caricatures, but as we said before, without falling into archetypes too much, because then you just make the same character over and over, game by game, and we won't advance in character development without this.
Yeah.
So exaggerating without falling into archetypes. It's one of the biggest challenges now.
But the way sorry, Mo, sorry.
No, okay. Yeah, the way I think about like this aspect is also very true for our games. How the characters, they need to be very unique, right? And I always think about it in layers. Like I think the first layer usually is one that is actually an archetype. We'd actually try to go for a very simple archetype that people can understand when they look at the character or hear them speak a couple of lines. It's usually a combination of these. And then in the layers below, make them interesting beyond that and make them like actual people who have actual problems that you can relate to, that are not just, I'm the cocky, whatever. And put maybe twists on the archetype as well. You can work that. So I think of it that way, that when I want people to look at our cast in the game, I want them to instantly be like, okay, I think this person is like that. And you can put a twist on that instantly, right? I mean, you can have visuals that completely are a twist on the archetype, and it's a completely different archetype, and have fun with that. But I wanted to look at it and be like, okay, I get this one, I got this one, I got this one. And then when they play the game after hours, they're going to be like, they have so much depth. There's so much more than that first look I first saw. But I think the first look is important to latch onto them, especially if we have 12, as you were saying, or in our case, 8. That is, without it, you're going to be lost, because people are going to just be lost in nuances from the beginning, and that's hard to latch on.
So sometimes you just need a strong hook for each character, and then you can develop them more in depth. But you still need this hook for the player to be hooked on, to know them and to love them. Even with the surprises of a twist, like you said, surprises are more than welcome by player most of the time, unless the surprises is like a Deus Ex Machina, which is just boring. But in character developments, surprises of a character, someone which may seem like just a character without depth, and he has one of the biggest stories, is quite a good surprise most of the time.
For fear of sounding reductionist, and I know that this is a huge topic and needs its own panel, but I am so much pro creating dramatization, like in any industry, or I mean entertaining industry, from books to series, movies, shows, or games. Who wants to hear about this just like non-dimensional, boring story? Even when you put something out there that is about a specific culture, you hear people saying, this never happens in our culture. It's like, really? Like, if we're creating a story or a movie that just describes the life of someone waking up, having breakfast, and then going to bed, who wants to watch that? And the whole point of storytelling and having a denouement, like a very complex story, is the fact that this is unusual. I'm going to tell you this very unusual story about this couple. And that's part of the attraction sometimes. You know what I mean? And of course, realism sometimes by itself is complex and bizarre. There's a movie with Scarlett Johansson. I think it's like a marriage story, or it's about her divorcing. Yeah. It is so beautiful. It's so beautiful because it's realistic and painful, and you see all of these raw emotions. But it's also by itself a unique, exaggerated element, right? It takes every single complexity of an element, puts it in front of you. So, you can't create two of that movie. So, I feel I'm more forgiving of creating Etoré, these very exaggerated, dramatic uniqueness, because I feel we do want to move away from what is more like one-dimensional character building.
Yeah, and I think those exaggerated and dramatical characters often comes from a more personal point of view and something more candid sometimes, which can lead to really appreciable characters, instead of going into the intellectual creation of a character, and you do 10 years of research for writing it, and it feels unnatural. Whereas just exaggerated and dramatical are simple axes of creation, but they work. You create immediately something lovable and likable, or hateable. Sometimes you want a character to be hated at first sight, because they have a weird voice. I don't know. They told very bad of all their friends, and it's the simple axes are often the best, I think, in creation. Even if going in depth after having used this axis of creation is good, I kind of like starting with the simple base of this quirky, exaggerated, dramatic creative character.
I'm an anti-war, non-violent person. I don't think I only slapped one person my whole entire life because they did something in a nightclub and I slapped them. It was just so. Coming from me, what I'm going to say next will relate to what you just said, Etoré. Someone who's very hateable. In Game of Thrones, I hated Littlefinger. And Sora and I my partner in life, went into this conversation of what could be a satisfying death to this character? What could please me to see on TV that could be meaningful enough that would satisfy me? It's the type of evil he has. And it's just you even hating someone with this type of emotion.
It's therapeutic. It's therapeutic to hate something, even if it's a false character or a created character. Sometimes we need to expose some emotions, and a good character can do that for someone. Like hating a bad character for something and wanting to kill it by 100 different ways, you will just sleep better after that. Well, you will be calm and relieved. All the bad emotions have gone.
I don't hold this emotion in general. Only when I'm watching the series and I see him do it, I just want him to die and disappear. He's complicating the lives of so many people. And but this type of emotion I was capable of having to this specific character. That's the one of all the series I've watched that I really wanted to just die. Why are you still alive? Everyone else died. So I can totally relate to those feelings. Moritz.
Yeah, which finally is actually kind of fitting for Littlefinger, right? Because he's such a cockroach. He just doesn't die. But I don't actually remember if he does, but yeah, whatever. No, I get that, and I think what's important about the whole thing in the end, of course, as well, is if a character is lovable or hateable, the fact that he's you can do any of these or she with that character means that it's well written. Usually, like if you have a goal with a character, right, and you want a certain emotion to happen, and as you said before, the flat line of not having any emotion when consuming any type of media, that's the worst case. Like unless you're specifically trying to do something that does that, as I mean, Marriage Story isn't a flat line, but that's, you can create something that's mundane and still great because it's mundane. But then that's a very creative decision you make and say, I want to make the mundane interesting in this piece, maybe. So I think that any type of emotion is good, even if maybe sometimes it's not intended. Like the best one is the intended one, but even if it's one that comes up and people didn't intend to happen, it can be great. I remember we have in our game, there's one, I'm not going to spoil it because it's at the end of the game, but we have a huge emotional moment in Shadow Tactics. And I think it's still narratively the best moment we've created in our games since, like, it's been some time ago, but we have not come close to that. And people stopped playing the game after that. Like there were people who are like, I hate this. Why did this happen? But what it created true emotion. Like it made them truly emotional about what just happened there. And they were so mad at the game for doing that to them that they stopped. And this is great. I was like,
yeah.
Awesome. I would prefer this 100 times over people just playing through it, being like, and just going on. Like it should be the right moment. It shouldn't be after 5 minutes, but I love that. So if it creates emotion, that's what I want. Like
well,
that's the thing. That's
to Frostpunk, right? It triggered an emotion in the end. You said it. It was in the end. You don't want it at the beginning, but it triggered a very strong reaction. And maybe that's not a terrible thing. 11-bit studios.
True.
Maybe it's a good thing.
It is like why we create for in a way in the end, right? I mean, why art exists is to create an emotional reaction in some way, or to just divert your time and have fun and have escapism. That's fine. But if something creates an emotion and it's intended to do so, that's great. Like I love it.
All right. Is there anything else you want to offer people who are tuning into this conversation that worth bringing up, or do you feel like we should wrap up?
I would just have the single thing that for game devs watching this, if you make games where you intersect narrative, because we're talking in the strategy, I mean, we talked about many things, but in the strategy sector where you have like a systemic approach to character building or narrative a lot, where you have to struggle with how to combine characters and narrative with the systemic parts of your games, try pushing that because it's so interesting. And I think it's what actually makes this medium unique. And we should try to embrace it. And while we might not do it as well in our games as I wish, everybody who does it, I love you for doing that, because it really might create what creates that niche for games in narration and storytelling.
Etoré, any last words?
Yeah, I think it will be more simple than words, but don't be scared to create strong and exaggerated characters with dramatization. We talked about it before, but it's something I live for. Character building, and those strong characters that can be really hated and loved is a quite good feeling. So if you want to be a narrative designer sometimes, write a lot of characters, eliminate like 80% of them, and only keep the one you love or hate the most, and you will have good characters.
All right. Well, thank you, Moitz. Thank you, Etoré, for joining me on this panel. It was really nice talking to you and getting to know you through the games that you make and the conversation and all the beliefs that you hold. So thank you for joining me today. And of course, I thank TactiCon for trusting me in doing this job of moderation. I hope it was satisfactory what I've done. Thank you again, and see you around, I guess.
See you again. Thanks for hosting. It was really, really pleasing.
Yes, agreed.